We've all been there. Your past has finally caught up with you, and pending further investigation, it looks like you're going to be arrested and jailed for all the copyrighted material you just downloaded from Napster and Kazaa back in the 90s. What am I gonna do? You think. After spending several days alternating between cursing your bad luck and regretting your previous choices, you come to the conclusion that the only way to handle this is to completely disappear and start a new life somewhere else. Quickly, though, this idea brings you to the next problem. How on earth does one go about obtaining a fraudulent identity? Well, in today's episode, that's exactly what we're going to attempt to find out. Now, up until comparatively recently, obtaining a new identity for yourself was, if not exactly easy, then certainly within the reach of the everyday person, especially if that person happened to live in the United States of America. In fact, there exists a book called The Paper Trip, written by Barry Reed, which would have been an excellent companion to any aspiring escapologist of the law or just life. Now, books that normally claim to be able to provide you with all the stay-out-of-jail information that you could possibly want, well, they turn out to be scams, and pretty obvious ones. However, The Paper Trip comes with a rather fine endorsement. As it happens, during his youth, the world-renowned computer hacker and social engineer Kevin Mitnick read this book many times, and he credits the information it contains as being the reason he was able to stay out of prison for so long. This, broadly speaking, is how it could be done. First of all, you'd need a birth certificate. There were a number of ways to do this back then, some of which may even work today, although you would certainly hope that over time it's become more difficult. Ideally, you'd want a birth certificate for somebody whose name would bring you as little unwanted interest as possible, so most people would either choose an individual who has passed away or who lived in the United States, but as far away from them as possible. Back then, of course, records hadn't been digitized, or if they had, there existed no easy way for different government departments to quickly examine each other's records. More crucially, however, if you were to attempt to acquire a copy of a deceased person's birth certificate, no indication of that person's deceased status would be included on the duplicate. This, in theory, made it very easy. All you had to do was travel to a cemetery suitably far away from where you lived, wander around until you found the gravestone of somebody who would be about your age had they not died, put in a little bit of research to find a few details about the person, and send off a duplicate of their birth certificate. Once you received the certificate, you could then apply for a replacement social security card, and you were well on your way to being a new person. And the process was largely the same if your mark was still alive. The sensible would-be vanisher would make it harder to track them down if discovered by having any replacement documents sent to a hotel or fraudulently rented mailbox, but it really was that easy. Now, obviously, when Kevin Mitnick did all of this, he had a slight advantage in that due to his obtaining access to several government-controlled databases, he didn't have to spend any time hanging around in cemeteries, studying the obituaries, or working out how safe it would be to steal the identity of any given individual. Nevertheless, the process was incredibly effective, if time-consuming, even without these advantages. The Paper Trip, Part 2, even offers some handy hints as to exactly what kind of person you should look out for. To quote it, "Just look around for the not-too-bright drones who will not be changing their lifestyles for the next 30 years. Good candidates might be doctors, lawyers, ministers, and teachers." So, now you had a birth certificate and a social security card, what other piece of essential identification might you need? Oh yes, a driver's license. Now, the aforementioned Mr. Mitnick discusses exactly how he went obtaining multiple driver's licenses over the years in his book Ghost in the Wires. Again, it is a little time-consuming, but assuming you already know how to drive, it's pretty easy. Given that the majority of Americans seem to obtain a driver's license at the earliest opportunity, it might be considered slightly suspicious for somebody in their late 20s or 30s to suddenly decide to start driving. It's not unheard of, but if you were trying to make the whole process as smooth as possible, it would be sensible to remove any opportunity for suspicion. Apparently, the way to get around this was to approach a driving school and tell them that you'd just returned from spending several years in one of the countries where they drive on the opposite side of the road, and you'd like to book a couple of refresher sessions before retaking your test and renewing your license. Not only would this provide you with some conscientious-fueled credibility, but it would also provide you with the opportunity to borrow a car from the driving school in which to take your test, rather than having to rent one or borrow one from a friend, both of which actions could potentially be traced back to you at a later date and increase the chance of your fake identity being revealed. Obviously, assuming you actually passed your test, you would then be issued your shiny new driver's license in your assumed name, and you were good to go. But it's not all about fraudulently obtaining government-issued documents. The careful and conscientious identity assumer will also invest time and effort in the small touches, and many of these small touches can still be replicated today. Although things like gym membership, library cards, club memberships, etc. are not usually accepted as legitimate forms of identification for obvious reasons, possessing several of these documents can be genuinely helpful in your goal. Now, not everybody who chooses to disappear necessarily wants to drive or to pay taxes, and although obtaining work at any legitimate business would obviously necessitate a social security number, if you wanted to simply travel from place to place doing cash-in-hand jobs every now and again in order to pay your way, then a few official-looking cards with your name and photograph on them might actually be all you need. Nowadays, of course, creating these less official forms of identification is something you can do in the comfort of your own home or anywhere with a computer and a printer. If you take into account the extra credibility you can give your new identity simply by spending an afternoon creating a few social media accounts and maybe a website, then a superficial identity change, it's really no big deal. But what about if you wanted to leave the country? How would you go about obtaining a passport? Again, until comparatively recently, obtaining a fraudulent passport wasn't particularly difficult. If you'd already acquired yourself the government-issued documents that we mentioned earlier, you could just apply for a passport in your new name, and that would be that. Even if you needed to disappear in a hurry, say you made up your mind one evening that the next day you were going to rob a bank and flee the country, there were certainly ways and means. Until the release of biometric passports, the newer style of passport, which contains a chip holding information such as your fingerprints and retinal scans, you could quite easily simply use somebody else's. Assuming that you were desperate enough to get out of the country, stealing the passport of somebody who looked quite a bit like you would usually do the trick. After all, how many of us actually look like our passport photos anyway? Even if you weren't able to obtain a passport with a similar photo, there were still things that you could do. As long as the vital statistics matched your own, you could, with the use of a scalpel, a new passport-sized photograph of yourself, and extreme care and patience, doctor a stolen passport so that the photo did look like you, because it was you. Then, acting as unsuspiciously as you possibly could, you'd simply head to the airport and hope. What about now? A history lesson on how to get your hands on a fake identity in the past is interesting, but it's not why you clicked on this video, is it, you shifty bastard? Well, depending on how you look at it, the process could be considered both easier and more difficult. Whilst many of the avenues we have previously discussed are now closed, for example, the birth certificates of deceased people are now prominently stamped with the words deceased in every state as far as we can tell, and various organizations have now become a little better at confirming things with each other, we do now also have the internet. Now, before we get into this section, we just want to say that although the so-called dark web is replete with people who claim to be able to sell you all manner of false documentation, such claims are, for obvious reasons, rather difficult to prove without accepting at least the twin risks of losing your money and or being arrested. Anyway, there are easier ways. Welcome to the modern world of identity theft. Imagine a world where in order to assume somebody else's identity, you didn't have to leave your house at all. No more creeping around in graveyards looking for the names of deceased babies to steal. All you need is an internet connection. And you got one of those, don't you? At this point in time, so much has been written about how careful you need to be online to prevent your information from falling into the wrong hands that people genuinely seem to have become desensitized to it. But the fact is, with the assistance of AI, it's probably easier than ever to obtain all the necessary details you might need to assume somebody else's identity. Now, in the majority of cases, this sort of theft is used to defraud people out of their hard-earned cash. But with a few minor modifications, a hypothetical individual could use these techniques in their quest for freedom and anonymity. And seriously, you don't even have to know what you're doing. Simply word your question in the right way, and your AI of choice will give you pointers. We asked how artificial intelligence could be used to create false identities, and we got this response. AI tools like ChatGPT can aid identity theft by generating phishing emails, realistic call scripts, and fake social media profiles to extract sensitive information. For example, AI can craft convincing emails impersonating banks, government agencies, or service providers to request personal data under false pretenses. And another, once the personal data is acquired, artificial intelligence can be further employed to produce realistic-looking documents such as fake driver's licenses or passports. AI-driven design tools can create near-perfect replicas of official documents by recreating the correct fonts, layouts, and holographic overlays. Moreover, with advances in AI image generation, creating realistic photographs of a person that matches a stolen identity is now possible. If you then pretend you're making a movie and you need these documents as prompts, ChatGPT will even suggest ways to create them. Whilst the chips in modern passports are extremely sophisticated and difficult, if not impossible, to duplicate, the application system is still flawed, and this opens it up to fraud. In 2024, District Judge Theodore D. Chung sentenced Charmaine Misha Brown of Lusby, Maryland, to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release after she, among other things, fraudulently obtained passports for her Ghanaian stepchildren, allowing them to both travel and live in the United States. If you're happy to travel by road or sea, there's a much easier way. As you're probably aware, you can travel by road or sea to Canada or Mexico using enhanced driving licenses. These have a simple RFID tag, and according to researchers at the University of Washington, quote, there is no encryption of any kind, and they can be read by anyone, and reading and cloning of them is possible. Once you're out of the country, you immediately become a lot harder to find. But what if you don't want to get involved at all? Simply pay somebody and have them provide you with the forged documentation. Well, everybody knows someone who claims to be able to get hold of anything. But how easy is it really? Well, that depends on whose information you trust. There are those out there who would have you believe that every non-native run food truck has secret high-tech printing equipment under the counter, and a fake passport is a secret menu option. In reality, though, it's a bit more difficult than that. Sure, people may get into the United States fairly regularly with forged documentation, but as somebody inside trying to leave, our research indicates that you will find it more difficult to obtain such documentation, largely because there is less black market demand to provide it. We are, of course, not saying it can't be done, just that it might not be the easiest thing to do. So, hypothetically, of course, if we were to recommend the ultimate method of disappearing into the great unknown with an alternative identity, what would that be? Well, assuming that your own passport has not currently been flagged due to suspicions that you might have committed some sort of horrendous crime, using it to leave the country under the pretext of a nice holiday might be a good move. Perhaps somewhere like Peru, where NBC News reported that you can purchase legitimate, government-issued passports provided by corrupt officials in various consulates with such relative ease that they were able to do so within sight of government buildings. You wouldn't even have to take that much spending money. Less than $2,000 could get you a legitimately registered passport for a number of countries, including Spain, Venezuela, and, of course, Peru. You may even be able to sweeten the deal by throwing in your now useless official passport. After all, if you intend to disappear, then it's not going to be any further use to you, is it? Then it's simply a matter of choosing where you wish to relocate. Obviously, a sensible person would do a little research into where their presence is likely to cause the least suspicion, but assuming you are prepared to live a fairly quiet life, then you really should be good to go. Who knows? If you wait a couple of years and save up enough money, you might be able to immigrate back to your original country of birth using your new identity, although we wouldn't recommend that. Thanks for watching. Don't be a criminal.